Welcome to my presentation about documentation avoidance. I think this is something that a lot of developers want, at least avoiding documentation, that is. So let's work out how I'm sitting with the audience here. I want you to put your, audience participation, sorry. I'd like you to put your hand up and keep it up if you're a software developer, just to check that you're in the right conference. That's good, reassuring. Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if you've written some documentation this year. Yeah, that's sort of almost everybody. Right now, but keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if you liked it. Yeah. So what this proves is that people do write software documentation, but none of you are willing to admit this in public. And I think this is, this is the documentation problem. We have this idea that even if you like writing documentation, we're not going to admit that, and just maybe you don't like writing documentation at all. We don't talk about this very much, which is a shame, because I think we can do something about it. And in particular, I think we can do something about avoiding writing documentation quite so much. So I want to start by looking at what is the documentation problem, starting with what are the causes of documentation. If you've got some problem, some disease, what are the causes of the disease? It's these, well, not literally, but I mean metaphorically, these are M&Ms. Managers cause documentation, and meetings cause documentation. Coding doesn't cause documentation quite so much. Coding causes code. That's better. So why else does it come from? It turns out that there are several causes of documentation and documentation demand. So you're a software developer, you join a new project team, and suddenly this happens. And I'm not talking about the JavaScript frameworks thing, but the fact that you sometimes end up with, also not literally Chinese, but some kind of unfamiliar domain. You're working in insurance for the first time, and you haven't got a clue what anybody's talking about. You'd really rather that somebody else had written something down to explain what everything means. So, because some problem domains are complicated, and there are whole books about them, and some don't have any documentation. But you need documentation to explain the domain sometimes. Right, sometimes this happens. So this is a performance of a Shakespeare play in London. I've even forgotten which one. But around 1600, so hundreds of years ago, when Shakespeare wrote this and this was performed, I'm led to believe that the audience understood the text, that they laughed at the jokes, they understood the references. But today, Shakespeare's plays are harder to understand. I didn't really enjoy studying that at school because the text didn't really make much sense. And we had to have lots of other documentation to explain the jokes and to explain what the text meant and to explain what the old words meant. So this situation we also have in code. And what happens there, it turns out Shakespeare wrote legacy poetry. It's good stuff. It's just that we don't understand it anymore. It was clearer at the time. And the same thing happens with code. But of course, not all legacy poetry is as well documented as Shakespeare's, and not all legacy code either. And so sometimes you find yourself looking for the documentation. And so centuries later, JeanFranois Me painted this scene of a pastoral scene in France, northern France, developers looking for the documentation. Thank you to classic programmer paintings for this one. You're looking for the documentation, it's not there. It's worse. It's not just that there's no documentation. There are people who know, but they leave. So, enterprising software developer based in Norway called Rob Smallsher did some fancy modeling of the dynamics of development teams. And he worked out, and I quote, if you work on a team that numbers 10 developers, you can expect half of them, 5, to leave at some point in the next 3.1 years. In other words, he calculated that the half-life of development team members is just a few years. Now that's a problem because the half-life of everything else is longer. So the takeaway here is that you write code and it's going to be around for longer than the developers who wrote it. If you turn this around, say you start a greenfield project and you've got half a dozen developers. After how many years was most of the code written by somebody who's now left? That only takes about 5 years. So people leave, and then you wish they'd written something down before they left. So that's a problem too. These are just a few examples, but there are different causes of the need for documentation caused by different kinds of people. And we don't all like writing documentation. So I do like writing documentation, but I write documentation so you don't have to. Also, writing documentation is a different skill. Programming is fairly hard, so is writing documentation. And it's a different skill, so what are the chances that you do both? Right, so the most important thing I think I can give you today are some tactics for not writing documentation. I think that's going to be the biggest, or at least the most useful takeaway. And there is good news here, is that you can, in a fairly constructive way, apply some tactics for avoiding writing documentation. But before I get into that, it is worth asking yourself, how much is it worth to you? How important is it to you to not write documentation? Because if you put your mobile phone number at the top of the source code and be on call for the rest of your life, you never have to write anything down. So this is my first tactic, and it's not the best one I've come up with. So we're going to look for something better. And so that's the rub. You can avoid writing documentation, but you don't want to give yourself a worse problem than that. So what we're going to instead do is do something a bit more programmer-focused and apply constructive laziness. Constructive laziness is also known as the art of turning boring work into a programming problem and getting away with it. Ways of writing code instead of doing the thing that you are supposed to be doing. So the idea of constructive laziness is not very new. I first came across it in programming Perl in the 90s. It's also mentioned in Eric Raymond's famous essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And this is the idea of thinking hard and coming up with some clever programming solution to something you don't want to do. Usually with an interesting result. And even if it still takes you longer, well, at least you've got to write code instead of doing the other thing. And so that idea of constructive laziness is the core of documentation avoidance, trying to come up with clever ways of not writing documentation. And so it's not a bad thing. I want to emphasize that I'm not looking for the negative ways of not writing documentation, like hiding, just saying no. But, well, just saying no when someone phones you up and they say, where's the documentation? And you just tell them, it's on the wiki. So if you haven't seen The IT Crowd, British television comedy, I do recommend it. In The IT Crowd, our hero, Roy here, does IT support the way that we should also do documentation. He's doing just-in-time documentation. So what's going on here is that somebody is asking for something, some information. And so step one is don't write it down. Step two is to lie blatantly and say, oh, it's on the wiki. They say, how does the authentication work in our application? It's on the wiki. And they'll go away, which in the short term is great. So problem solved. No documentation written. Annoying person who's interrupted you when you were coding, despite the fact that you had headphones on. That's been solved. And so they go away, don't write the documentation yet, because sometimes they don't come back. Sometimes they figure it out for themselves. And so sometimes the documentation demand is just laziness, but the bad kind of laziness. And so you can fight bad laziness with good laziness, not write the docs, tell people to go away, because only if they really need it will they come back and say, they'll tell you I looked, I couldn't find it. Bluff again, say, oh, well, I'll look for it for you. And this is the moment that you write the documentation, just in time. And then you tell them later, oh, I found it, here it is. Send them a link. Hope they don't look at the page creation date. And this is something that you can get away with a lot. So it's not great, though, because you do, in some cases, still have to write the documentation. But it at least reduces the size of the problem. It reduces the number of times that you have to write the docs. So here's an illustration of another strategy. Now, this is blatantly a cheesy stock photo that I found on the internet of somebody answering a question by patiently explaining it to a colleague. I'm pretty sure that that's not a programmer, because that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is just sit down and write the code. So you could do this. You could take the time to patiently explain the answers to questions instead of writing things down. And again, it works, but it's not great as a solution. But all of these half solutions, all of these not ideal solutions to the need for documentation, make it less bad, make the problem less bad. Reverse just-in-time documentation is a bit more cool. So the best kind of documentation avoidance is getting somebody else to do it. That way you get the docs, which you basically do need sometimes, but you don't have to write them. It's okay to have somebody else do it. I mean, they're not at this conference today, so think about your colleagues back in the office. They're going to write the docs tomorrow. And this is how you do it. You have some need for documentation, and obviously you're using some kind of chat room like Slack or IRC, and you just kind of casually ask these questions, and people answer the questions because they think, yeah, great, if I type on the chat room, I'm not going to get interrupted. So as developers, we buy into the idea that we use team chat. Very useful, great. It avoids the need for meetings, it stops people interrupting you, but it does make you vulnerable to this tactic where your colleagues will trick you into writing documentation into the team Slack room, which they will then copy-paste into where the doc should really live. I've got a colleague, so I work remotely, and I use Skype a lot, and I've got a colleague who's written a lot of code. Some of it is tricky to understand because it's a complex domain, and there are no comments in the code. So I open up one of these classes, and I'm thinking, I'm not really sure why we have one of these classes, or what is the difference between these two classes that look kind of similar. So I Skype him. I press the button Skype. I say, hey, Tom. I say, what's one of these? Why do we have this class? What's its role? What does it do? How is it different from the other class? And then when he tells me the answer over Skype, I just say, well, slow down, I'm typing. And I just in time to type the documentation comment that should be there. And it was months before he realized that this was what I was doing. I would just get him to write the documentation at the point when I needed it. All I did was the typing. And I can touch type, so that wasn't too hard. This is one of my favorite strategies. Getting somebody else to, in small doses, write the documentation that's needed at the latest responsible moment. Of course, the latest responsible moment for documentation is during the project. It's not when somebody says, oh, I can't take it anymore, this project has no documentation, I quit. If one of your team members has quit their job, 1 or 2 months' notice, then you're at risk of one of the managers, a development manager, perpetrating the handover delusion. And they say, oh, well, that person who's leaving, who never wrote documentation, they will just write everything down now. I mean, why does that sound like a reasonable thing to say? That's never going to work. It doesn't work. If somebody's quitting and they haven't written documentation, it's too late. So do not fall into this trap and suppose that this person is going to spend their notice period writing docs. I mean, they're going to spend their notice period at the coffee machine, hanging around, generally having a good time, because really they don't care anymore. They've quit. The best thing you can do in this scenario is pair programming. So just forget the documentation thing. It's too late for that. Pair programming works because that's a very fast way of getting this information into the head of your next programmer, who maybe you want to think about having them write some documentation. Pair programming is very efficient, it's very tiring to do, so you might have to handcuff the person who's leaving to the desk so that you can then take it in turns to make them pair program. You do tag pair programming. You take it in turns to do an hour each. By the end of the day, they'll wish they'd quit or something. But pair programming is cheaper and effective. And it's a short-term measure because, of course, the next person on the team might quit as well, because that happens too. But at least it buys you some time. Right, let's talk about something slightly different. Any user interface designers in the room, please look away now. You do not want to see this. Right, this happens. I found this online somewhere. I'm not entirely sure what it is, because every time I look at it, I have to look away. It's horrid. I think it's a Windows user interface for grep or something like that. Or maybe find, some kind of command line. Find, or I don't know, something like that. This is what happens when developers design user interfaces. Not all developers should be allowed near a user interface. I mean, some can do it. Some become user interface specialists. Most don't. This is what my user interface would look like. Or maybe the web version of this. It's not prettier, it just takes up more space. And it has lots of links. So in the last, let's say, 10 years, we've got used to the idea that designing user interfaces is a specialist skill. We shouldn't expect every developer on the team to design the interface, because we know that this happens. And so we've learned from this. This is what happens on a one-person project. It's probably a one-person kind of shareware thing. And so the same thing applies to documentation. if somebody is perpetrating horrible code that needs explaining, needs documenting, then that's not going to be the person to write the documentation. It's highly unlikely that that person is going to be a brilliant technical writer and they're going to write clear documentation. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. You need documentation, but you don't need everybody to be good at writing it or to like doing it. So maybe you should consider it a specialist skill. Not everybody's good at visual design. Not everybody's good at documentation. So work out on your team. You have cross-functional teams, right? You have a mix of diverse skills. Do that. That's a good plan. Work out who's best at writing the documentation. If I'm on your team, that's probably me. Only because I like it. I don't have to be better at it. I just like it. Right, it's time for kittens. There should be cats in every presentation. Not because it's remotely relevant to the presentation, it's just that all of that code is a bit heavy. And they're cute. But I've got kittens in the code as well. So it's time for some code. Code comments are, bizarrely, the most hated form of documentation among programmers. I'm not entirely sure why this is. I think it's because you can't ignore them. They're in your face when you're writing code. They're right there in front of you. So fortunately, you don't need quite as many comments if you write better code. So this should be fairly obvious, but this is worth mentioning, that you can look at the top one. You've got a comment about what it does. And you can just come up with a better name. Get in method names is a real naming smell, an indication that the name's not very good. So come up with a better name. If you're describing what return values are, maybe you should have a type for that. I do hope you're using programming languages with types, although that's like the naming thing, that's a whole other presentation. If you have complex expressions, then again, naming, you can name them. And then you don't need the comment. You see, this version, it's just as clear. Doesn't need the comment. And this thing, please don't do this. We have version control for a reason. So, you don't need to say who wrote the code. Git knows that. But there's a crucial point here that some of us miss. We sort of know that if you write comments, that might be a sign that you haven't written very good code, and you can not need the comments if you write better code. Don't skip the step where you write better code. Don't just delete the comments or not write them in the first place. You do actually have to refactor the code as well. And there's another catch here. 2 of these rely on naming. And naming things is quite hard, they say. And so if you're not going to come up with perfect names, then you might not always be able to delete the comments. But it's worth getting better at it, because then you reduce the need for documentation. Right, here's another code example. I've got a whole load of documentation here about an API, describing preconditions and postconditions and the like, and then some method signature. And so I'm thinking that half of you are thinking, I say that half of the room, you're thinking that these should all be tests. And the other half of you, this half of the room, you're thinking, if we had a better programming language, we wouldn't have to write this code. You're both right. There are better technologies, better approaches to writing code that can wipe out the need for whole classes of documentation and comments. But again, you do have to actually use them. Otherwise, you're just left with incomprehensible Java code. And just think how much worse it would be if it was JavaScript. You wouldn't even have the types. Although I hear that flow type's getting popular. So JavaScript programmers use that type system. Anyway, so documentation avoidance is a collection of techniques, dodging the problem, giving the problem to somebody else, clever tactics to not make the documentation on your project worse, just not make it your own problem. And these work most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you do still need some documentation. So I figure I should help you with that scenario as well. For example, suppose that I told you to read this book. I said it was great. You should read this book. Has anybody read this book, War and Peace? 2 or 3 of you. Okay, so you're telling somebody you should read this book. It's absolutely great. Beautifully well written, classic literature, excellently translated from Russian. And you say, well, what's it about? And you say, well, it's really well written, so it just sort of explains itself as you read it. So all you just have to do is to read the whole thing, which will take you months, because it's self-documenting. We talk about code like this sometimes as well. Here's 100,000 lines of code, but it's self-documenting, beautifully written code. You know, we've achieved naming perfection, architectural mastery. We've even figured out how to use package structure in Java, and we didn't just lump all of the controllers in a controllers package. And it is beautiful code. No, nobody does that. And it's beautiful code, but there's too much of it. Where do you start? What's the first page? Where's the entry point? And so, as you'll notice, if you try this on management types, they've learned to push back and say, management summary is maximum half a page. I need an introduction. The introduction is too long. I need a summary of the introduction. So this is one of the kinds of documentation that you can't really avoid because you can't do it in code, really. You need a kind of introduction. And in an introduction, you explain a few things. You explain, what is this? Like, what is this? You know, it's a novel about people in Russia or something. I haven't actually read it. I don't know. It's too long. I mean, who's got the time? This code is, you know, it's a web application that is an online pet store or something. You know, that makes sense. And the purpose of this software, we built it so people could buy pets online, for example. That would be part of the introduction. And then people can think, okay, you're crazy, I don't want to work here. But, you know, you get the idea. And you can explain what's the general scope of the thing. What is its audience? Who is it for? And these things apply to written documentation just as they apply to code itself. You know, so if you're going to write a 50-page report, you need this kind of introduction. If you're going to write 50,000 lines of code, you need this introduction as well. And explain, you know, concisely, in a page or so, roughly what's going on. And this is the thing where when you join the team, if you read this first, you're oriented. You've got a sense of what this is all about. And then you can dive into the code. It gets you started. It gets you over the first day. You know how to start. So this is a big help. And it doesn't have to be very much. Sometimes this happens because our code is not perfect. So there's something wrong with this picture. What's going on there? Why are they not the same color? I mean, many of us are obsessive enough to find that slightly disturbing. I have no idea why. No idea why there are two kinds of phone boxes in London. Or even why there are phone boxes anymore. I mean, when's the last time you used a public phone? But, so you have to explain why. You know, it's all very well having this kind of online pet store application, but that's the most ridiculous software example ever. I mean, who'd buy pets online? Seriously. It's never going to happen. So you have to explain why. And this is one of the things you cannot do in the code itself. The code can communicate the design, it can communicate the functionality, it can communicate the technology. It can't say why you wrote it. I mean, if there's a way of doing it in a new programming language, I'd be very interested. And this is such an important idea that this guy wrote a whole book about it. Managers love this. I haven't read this book either. Who's got the time? But, I mean, the CEO of the company I work for, he says, you know, you start every presentation with the why. Explain why you're doing what you're doing. So do that in your code as well. So it's worth compromising sometimes on avoiding the documentation and doing a little bit of it, because many of you admitted to writing documentation, you know, and maybe this just avoids worse problems like being summoned to meetings or being on call. And if you're going to have to write some documentation, that's fine, but try not to do very much. Right, next section, I want to introduce some ways to document code that don't feel like documentation. This is the next important idea. I've noticed that, you know, we're all programmers, and there are other people who are not programmers. Let's call them normal people. But it turns out that lots of them are sort of programmers really, like they do lots of stuff in spreadsheets. I've got a customer who says, I'm not technical, I'm an economist, I work for a financial services company. But it turns out that he writes hundreds of lines of Visual Basic for applications in Excel. But he still says, I'm not technical, it's a mindset. So That's fine. Actually, that's a very healthy thing. I mean, be a programmer without realizing you're a programmer. So maybe write some documentation. As long as it doesn't feel like documentation, you might not experience it as a negative thing, even if deep down you know that you're writing docs. What I've found very encouraging in recent years is how many more kinds of documentation there are than when I first started being a software developer. Because back in the day, there were two kinds of documentation. There was a functional specification and a technical specification. And that was it. That was all you had, one or the other. Both were these sort of voluminous Microsoft Word documents. I worked on one project, the document was so big, using this sort of master document feature in Microsoft Word that no one ever really should have ever used. And it crashed Windows. It was just too heavy, this big document. Word couldn't cope. It was pages. It was printed out in multiple volumes and stacked on the shelf. Now, fortunately, we don't do that anymore. Please don't do that. Please don't write volumes of technical specification and print them out and put them on the shelf. Instead, look for alternatives. Look for things that don't really feel like documentation. And keep it close to the code. Put it near the code. Don't put it on the shelf. So there's two ideas here. Make it not like docs. Make it near the thing that it documents. Near is a bit of a vague idea, but maybe you'll get the idea. So the nearest thing that I've mentioned before to the code is comments, because they're in the code. But this is a tricky subject, because as I said, programmers do get pretty weird about code comments. It's almost a taboo subject. But strangely, all programming languages, despite all of their other crazy differences, they all have comments. There are a couple of exceptions, I guess, like white space, but they don't really count. And so when you look at different ways of documenting software, it turns out that in many scenarios, comments are not the worst, provided that the audience for that documentation are the people reading the code, the development team. So it won't always work, but try and find your piece with comments in code. I'm going to have to move on from comments, because that could be the whole presentation. I could talk for hours about comments, but not today. Here's something completely different. This is a git commit message. This is from a blog post describing how to write git commit messages. Because, nobody writes comments in code, but you should write a git commit message with a title, multiple paragraphs, and lists and stuff. I mean, this is quite a bit like writing a comment. But, that's fine. I mean, if this works for you, if your way of avoiding writing comments is to just write, 100 words of git commit message to document the changes in the code, then that's absolutely great. So look for some alternative that you like. I mean, this is kind of like event sourcing for comments. You just describe the updates rather than the current state. And event sourcing is cool, so this must be cool, I guess. And if you've got some nice tooling for this, where you can see the latest comments side by side with the code, that's probably pretty nice. And there's this whole sort of advice about what kind of things you would put in the commit message to describe the change. And then you can understand the code by kind of replaying, like event sourcing, replay the events, read through the commit messages to understand how the code has evolved. And I'm guessing, as I said, if you do this, you probably don't write comments, one or the other. Choices. So choices, having options are what works. So that one I don't do. What I do like, though, is README-Driven Development. This is a spectacularly good idea. I wish it was mine, but it wasn't. It's a blog from somebody called Tom Preston Warner. This is the idea that you do need some documentation, but you don't need 100 pages or a big volume. You need something in the middle. And the most important thing in the idea about README-driven development is the middle doesn't really mean the middle. The README doesn't mean 0, it just means 1% of the traditional amount of documentation. A tiny amount is enough. Just give the introduction. Just put a README file in your GitHub repo. Try and explain the important things there, and try and set things up that that's all you need. It may well all be all you need. And README-driven development has the shocking idea that you might do it first. I mean, it works for the TDD folks, so why wouldn't it work for documentation too? But yeah, crucially, middle ground means hardly any docs. Here's another example of a technique I spotted recently, is writing little independent documents as single, in this case, some markdown files in a GitHub repo. Have a documentation repo where when something needs explaining, you just write it once. sort of fire and forget. You have this little self-contained piece of documentation. You don't have to think about high-level structure because you can clone the repo and you have command line tools for searching things. And this makes it very easy to find docs. It's quite easy to write these. Just describe solving one short problem. And something that does one thing, single responsibility, independent of the other things, you can release them separately. This is like the microservices of documentation. And microservices are definitely the hotness, so this is an excellent idea. And then you can have a whole repo of these things. Okay. Note that, and this gives you version control, sort of obviously for free. And GitHub renders the markdown, so that's nice too. You do realize that good titles are going to be important for naming these things. We always get back to naming, but that's okay, because you're all expert at naming, I hope. But these things may be a gateway drug. I mean, if you start writing these things, and you're the person who kind of writes the how-to, when somebody says, how do we do authentication with OAuth? Don't get it. So you write the little how-to, how to make it work just in your specific situation. And that's great. That solves the problem. But you might like that. You might have the idea that you could publish that on an external tech blog because you're the only team in the world who's using this precise combination of JavaScript libraries. And so you have the top Google search result for a certain Google search query. And then people start reading your blog and you get famous. And you might like that too. And these are good things, actually. So, there is proper writing. Try it. You might like it. At least try it, find out whether you like it. And if you don't like it, stop. Please stop, because nobody's going to be happy if you plow on with something you don't like. And think about doing it in public. So make it a public repo, if it's a TIL repo, or just do it on Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow has a new docs thing. It's great. OK. I like it. No enthusiasm from the audience. People often ask me, OK, but how do we document our API, right? Because we're using microservices all of a sudden, and we have all these APIs, and what do we do? Now, I don't really have a good answer yet. Nobody's gone and written the book on how to document a RESTful API. Or a GraphQL API, it's all sorts of new stuff. So the best answer so far is to find examples that are good and copy them. So this is a page from the Spotify API documentation. Like War and Peace, I haven't actually used this API, but I hear this is an example of very well written, presented, and structured API documentation. And so I guess if you read through this, you can start to figure out, OK, if you copy this, you're probably very well off. And what's interesting about this style of API documentation, which is quite essential if you've got a published public API that's going to be used by people you don't meet. I mean, documentation's all you've got, or they phone you up. So what's interesting about this is that it's very structured. It's highly structured, decomposed into little bits. Because that's how REST works. You identify HTTP resources, and you break it down into the HTTP verbs that they support, and you break that down into different representations of data. And so it doesn't really feel so onerous to write. It doesn't feel like writing pages of documentation, because all you have to do is write one sentence in each place. And writing one sentence, it's like Twitter. And so it's like the Twitter of documentation. Although Twitter's not as cool as it was, but yeah, maybe I shouldn't have made that. Anyway, but you should definitely try writing this kind of documentation. Now, at this point, somebody always says, what about Swagger? Then we don't have to write the docs, we just generate the docs. Well, Swagger does the layout for you, and it does the publication, it does the structure, but it doesn't actually write the docs for you. I mean, if you've read a blog post on medium.com, you might have seen how it kind of has this nice presentation of blog posts, and if you've written one, it's got this nice user interface for writing the blog post, and it's great, but it doesn't actually write the blog post for you. You still have to do that yourself. And that's kind of the same with Swagger. These human-readable sentences, the ones in English, the English bits, they don't get generated. So you would still have to write those. Interestingly, if you drill down a bit in these documentation, this is about an album, which are these things we used to buy with songs on before we downloaded everything. But it remains as a concept. And so they have short explanations of each of the bits of data in an album. This is an example of a domain that's just complex enough that the details need a little bit of explanation. This is a data dictionary. That's very classic, kind of old school form of documentation, but it's a very, very useful one. And it's not so painful to write because you just write little snippets at a time. Anyway, that was kind of a side note. So I think still, for now, the best public API docs are ones that you actually write by hand. And Swagger is great if you're going to do stuff internally, but you don't really see third-party public APIs published using Swagger. So for now, you still need to kind of probably write Markdown by hand and generate a website or something. GitHub's own API documentation is another example of beautifully written docs, nicely structured. So use the tools, but don't be tricked into thinking that you don't have to write any documentation. Let's go back. I mentioned Slack earlier when I was talking about just-in-time documentation. And so team chat is a bit of a revolution for developers. If you never had it and suddenly you have it, you can't think how you ever went without. And it's been around for decades. But IRC has now been kind of reinvented as slightly more cool things, because now we have Markdown and emoji and bots. And these are all great things that make it all a bit more interesting. And this kind of works as documentation, because people type a lot, and they're not only exchanging pictures of cats. Sometimes they're actually answering each other's questions. Now, this is great, provided that you can find that stuff again. So you do have to have search for this to work. So the lack of search is why you can't use Skype for team chat. And the search is why you ultimately do have to pay for Slack. But, I mean, it's money, but it's only money. That means that you would have less documentation to write, so that's got to be worth it. So go and tell everybody to. Slack should pay me to say this. They really should. And there are alternatives. So I'm using Gitter, which I quite like. And the search is basic, but works. And this saves us writing things down, because you just remember that somebody asked the question before, and you just search and you find. We don't need a lot of that how-to documentation if it's been mentioned in the team chat. And there are other tools. Occasionally, you do need to kind of write the documentation length thing, but by now, we've gone through so many alternatives that this should be a real exception. This should not be how you normally approach documentation. But if I think back, when I stopped using word processors and started using Wiki instead, which was about 2005, more than 10 years ago, gave up word processors, switched to wikis. And that was a great step forward, because it lowered the barrier to creating and publishing and sharing documentation. And you had things like search. Strangely, wikis have sort of stagnated a bit. Confluence isn't even a wiki anymore. And there's no new things in wiki software. So maybe in the same way that wikis were not a better word processor, they were something else. Maybe we're now seeing things that are not wikis, like GitHub just as a documentation tool, and Slack as a documentation tool. So you may still need a wiki. I guess my current favorite is GitHub Wiki, just because it's so simple. It doesn't have all this kind of complexity to fiddle with. Because let's face it, these days, if you try and write documentation in Confluence, it's got so many options to play with that you never get around to writing the documentation. It's a bit like PowerPoint. If you use PowerPoint for presentations, I mean, you're fiddling with animations. It's amazing I ever finished preparing these slides. And while we're at it, coming up with, I didn't invent any of these techniques. I just kind of found them by searching while we're searching this talk. So I guess I should at least, invent one kind of documentation, which is sadly not used enough. This is the earlier code example with the things that should maybe be tests or I don't know, add a 95 or something. 2 exception types. So an illegal kitten exception, I think, is best explained by this picture. For example, now you know exactly what we mean by not a kitten. It's a plushy toy. And obviously, this is what a null kitten exception would look like. And actually, while we're talking about jokes, here's a sort of counterexample to normal documentation. This is a programming language tutorial. It's an introduction to Prolog, which is a kind of interesting, because different, programming language. But the tutorial is called the Prolog lightbulb joke. And what you can't read at the top because it's tiny text, it says, but this is the whole tutorial. It says something like, the purpose of this tutorial, this is good, he started with why. The purpose of this tutorial is to teach you enough Prolog so that you understand the Prolog lightbulb joke. Isn't that the best motivation for documentation there ever was? Does anyone here know anything about Prolog? Ever come across that? Okay, so a few of you might know the answer to the Prolog light bulb joke, which is about the pain of trying to write Prolog program. Because you write a Prolog program, and it's long and complicated, and you expect it to give you some insightful answer, and it just says false. If you meet any Prolog programmers, they might find that funny. Okay, how are we getting on? So I've talked a lot about some concepts, some ideas, some techniques that seem to be out there, but I just want to give you at least some more concrete, practical tips that you can use tomorrow. So, and there's some repetition here, because I mentioned READMEs already, and that's an important point all by itself. Documentation is not quite the same as code. In documentation, a little bit of repetition is a good idea. Not repeating yourself is actually a bad habit in documentation. Anyway, write an introduction for your software to explain what it's for, why it exists, and how big it is, what it covers. And maybe you don't need any more documentation than that. Maybe that's just enough. The next kind of thing that's going to be valuable is detailed step-by-step installation instructions. That's something that everybody on the team will get value from, because everybody who joins the team has to set up a development environment, build the software. After day one, everybody on the team might go and do different things. And so after day one, any documentation isn't going to be relevant for everybody. But the setup stuff, you get a lot more value. It's kind of a multiplier, because everybody uses it. And this, write the step-by-step thing. Even if, and actually it's a bit like the code comments, you say, well, we don't need to document our setup because we've automated it all. Absolutely. So I hope that your step-by-step documentation says, clone the repo, run this script. Done. If it doesn't, then be honest about what you actually have to do to get a working development environment. And maybe then automate it as well. Write good code comments. I keep coming back to comments despite how unpopular this is, because they're quite powerful. The way to write comments is the same. The way to write good comments is partly the same as the way to write good documentation. Write very little of it, one sentence at a time. If you have a code base with no comments, which is quite common, I suppose, try maybe one sentence per class, just to explain why it's there, what it's for, why do we have one of these. And then refactor these comments. Don't add too much that you're never going to maintain it, because code maintenance is a problem, and anything that adds to the lines of code, including comments, is making that worse. So nothing's free. Refactor the comments. Delete the unnecessary comments in the same way that you delete unnecessary code. But here's the thing. How do you know whether they were unnecessary? And there's a trick. But I'll save that for later. I've got loads of time, right? I mean, loads of time left. But just try and be a little bit reasonable about comments. And remember, comments are not the enemy. It's meetings that you want to avoid. So the detailed instructions, I already said this. Be very, very explicit in your installation instructions. Every keystroke. Write it such that it could be automated. Write it such that anybody in the organization, whatever they do, if they're not a programmer, could follow the instructions. Because you think you're being clever if you're sort of skipping steps that are obvious, but you don't know what's obvious. And it's actually quicker to not even think about what's obvious and just document every single step. It's not as painful to write. It's actually quite easy. You just write down everything you have to do, everything you have to type. It makes it easier to automate as well, actually. It's kind of like a design documentation for automating your installation or your build. Same for the build. If you're doing release manually, I hope you're actually all going for continuous integration, or at least you have to press one button and that's it. But if you're doing it manually, then please have it written down and then automate it. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is audience. So in the same way that when you write software, we're supposed to think about who it's for and build what they need. Same is also true for documentation. Any kind of writing, write with the reader in mind. Work out, is it my future self? I mean, that's probably the best person to write for. Just assume that, like me, you're going to forget everything in 6 months' time and write the docs for yourself. It's a great moment the first time you Google something. You find the perfect Stack Overflow answer, and you wrote it yourself. Or a blog post, your own blog post that answers the problem that you've got again, and you forgot that you wrote that. That's great. But sometimes it's not for yourself or your colleague on the development team, but maybe it's for one of the managers. Maybe it's a business question. Maybe there are different things that you need to document. So think about the purpose and the audience. I've been going on about not writing much documentation, so I'm going to say it again. Minimum viable documentation is something that we should talk about. After all, Lean Startup has got very popular talking about minimum viable product. So as you'll have noticed, I'm just taking all of the ideas from all of the other things that are cool. Is documentation cool yet? No. But you get the idea. Don't write very much documentation. Just be aware that none is not enough. None is never enough. And very occasionally you need more. Most systems only need the README. But sometimes a system has some complexity somewhere. The user interface is weird, or it's got a huge data model with hundreds of tables in relation to a database, or it has some kind of complicated business process that it's supporting. And so each of these things correspond to specialist kinds of documentation. Data dictionary, a process diagram, that kind of thing. They exist, they're not common. But just be aware that sometimes when you're trying to get somebody else to write the documentation, you're trying to get them to write, some sort of substantial, detailed documentation. And if you get into documentation, there's loads of things you can find, but mostly, never use UML. I'm kidding. I mean, UML is never the answer. Boxes and arrows on a whiteboard, maybe, but not the rest of UML, because nobody can remember what those arrows mean. Choose the right kind of docs, that's simpler than UML. Just write Markdown. Avoid pictures because they're just too difficult. Or take photos of the whiteboard. Do the back of the napkin pictures. In fact, buy and read the book called Back of the Napkin that describes how to draw simple diagrams that communicate well. It's not art class. It's just about communication. Docs are about communication, right? And so just to mention a few of the things, and even in extreme cases, it turns out the presentations can be useful ways of sharing knowledge about something. Who knew? I mentioned Markdown, I'm going to mention it again. So things like XHTML and XSL formatting objects, converting, rendering, LaTeX, that kind of thing, they seemed like an excellent idea at the time. But they weren't, at least not for this kind of documentation. We've invented continuously over the last decades, especially related to web technologies, we've invented simpler versions of what we were using before. And for a lot of the stuff we do, discovering and adopting simplicity is the progress that we're making. And so the feature, not the bug of Markdown, but the feature is that you can hardly do anything with it. And only occasionally you need something a bit more. And so actually ASCII-Doc and restructured text are much more capable than Markdown. But if Markdown's good enough, use Markdown and convert it to one of the others later if you need another type. And never forget that HTML is still the markup language. You don't necessarily write it by hand, but it's kind of the format. Some of you laughed earlier. I must have told a joke or something. And that's not just for presentations. Technical documentation is usually way too boring. That's unnecessary. Add jokes. And there's no mystery about humor, really. I mean, you can just study this as well, work out what's funny, practice, whatever. And the great thing about humor in documentation is that nobody's expecting it. Timing is everything in humor, and that's just easier in documentation. So do that, use the right kind of documentation, use the right kind of tools. So this is the kind of stuff I like, the stuff that's simple, that works with the developer tools, or even that is the developer tools. So the great thing about using GitHub for documentation is that you're probably using it already. At least I hope you are. I mean, I really enjoy using GitHub compared to the things that I used in the pre-GitHub world. And as a final note, you could consider writing a book. I mean, it can be a successful thing. But this is really the waterfall development of docs, and waterfall development is not cool. So when I wrote this with my two colleagues, Eric and Francisco, it took 2 years. I mean, it was fun, and I learned a lot about writing, and it got me into being a technical writer a bit, which is now half of my job. The other half is coding. But really, you don't have time to write a book. It takes way too long. So we're just about done. Last slide, I promise. So writing documentation just some of the time feels like it's not what you want to be doing, but somebody's got to do it. So you need documentation. You don't need very much. So remember the minimum viable documentation. And remember that not everybody hates it. And work out who doesn't. And try and get them to write the docs. And maybe it's even you. Try it out. So that's it.